Okay, welcome everyone to the 13th podcast in this Empowering You for Purpose series of sessions. Today and for the next two sessions, actually, we're going to consider the family. So by way of introduction, the sacredness of the family as a God-ordained institution is on the line in this postmodern world in which we're now living. The family is really essential to our social fabric, because when the family falls apart, which we've seen over recent decades, increasingly falling apart, society then begins to fall apart. God designed family and marriage in order to populate the world. And we may think, looking at world population rates, well, mankind has done a pretty good job on that score. But what's interesting to note is that there are falling birth rates across Western nations. And this has profound societal implications. And if the birth rate drops below 2.1, which it has done in a number of Western nations, populations will begin to shrink unless they have immigration. And it's very difficult to sustain global society when there are not many children compared to having lots of people over, say, 65, more grandparents than there are grandchildren. So I want to just give a very brief recap of history where in relation to family, and particularly in terms of the Christian family and God's plan and purpose for the family. Because in God's heart, the family was very much designed really to empower us as people, men and women and children. But let's go back a couple of thousand years to the first century onwards, when the Roman Empire was ruling over much of Europe. But when we look back, it was the Christian family that actually won over a promiscuous and polygamous Roman culture. It was Christianity that attracted and empowered women, because polygamy, which is what it was under Roman culture, that weakens and enslaves women. It undermines a wife's ability to fight for her rights, her dignity. So it was instrumental in actually causing the church at that time to grow and to impact society. The early Christians prized female chastity, but unlike the pagans, they rejected the double standard that whilst they liked the women to stay chaste before marriage, the pagan men could just have sexual license. But what Rodney Stark draws out, a sociologist, as he looks back in history with his book, The Rise of Christianity, he said that the Christian men at that time were urged to remain virgins until marriage, in accordance with the scriptures, and extramarital sex was condemned as adultery. And Stark pointed out that the Christian widows also enjoyed substantial advantages over the non-Christian widows, who faced great social pressure to remarry. There may be fines, if they didn't remarry within a couple of years. But in contrast to that, the New Testament, you see in the writings of the Apostle Paul, he urged and required Christians to respect and care for the widow, particularly looking after the poorer ones, where the family couldn't look after them themselves. Christians also express this respect for women. And it's always interesting in this, because the Apostle Paul and Christians in general often are looked upon as kind of being very controlling when it comes to women and very disempowering. But the reality, as we look back into history, was quite the opposite. Jesus and Paul and the Bible actually the great liberators of women. And so another thing that happened at that time was that the age of marriage among the Christian women and girls, young women, was raised from 10, 14 years, that kind of period of time, where there could be child brides, literally. But the biblical sexual ethic we have in the New Testament gave Christian girls time to grow up first before they got married. In the Roman culture at the time, their temples were packed with male and female prostitutes. And much like the Hindu gurus and some of the yoga teachers that have many devotees today, on the pretext of purifying their chakras, their psychic centers in the body, that back then extramarital sex with a temple prostitute was considered a purifying, God-pleasing religious event, this kind of Gnostic enlightenment. But the long-term consequences of such prostitution, permissiveness, singleness, divorce, abortion, infanticide, and a decline of population in the Roman culture caused the number and size of Roman towns to reduce. And so they had to draft in barbarians from outside. Rome became vulnerable to attack. And this negative trend that was taking place in Rome at that time throughout the empire contrasted with the Christians who followed the biblical injunction to be fruitful and multiply. And naturally, as a result, the Christian population grew faster than those in the rest of the empire. And the Christians, obeying God's word in relation to sexual purity, stable marriage, care for the children, the orphans, the widows, benefited society at large. Moving into the Middle Ages, this was where some of the scholars misinterpreted the Bible and implied that getting married to a woman was in some way polluting. So during the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church promoted the idea that celibacy was more spiritual. It was a salvation by works, the mindset of we must deny ourselves pleasure, we must commit to pious works. And so celibacy became this sort of public proof of being spiritually superior. And joining a monastery was a guarantee to heaven. So we have this spiritual secular divide very much in evidence. And this spiritual pride that really went along with this led to a gross prejudice against women, where they were even viewed as being temptresses and a constant danger to men in society. We move forward to the 16th century, and we see the Protestant Reformation in Europe. And through Martin Luther and his writings and his revelation from Scripture, we see the status of marriage once again restored to an honourable state. It was no longer considered less spiritual. In fact, sex and marriage were a means to holiness. And the family, and not the monastery, was God's kind of ordained school of character. And there was the quote, which is a good one, I think: 1 year of marriage is better than 10 years in a monastery. In terms of the formation of character, I'm sure all those who are married would see that as being very true. And it was Luther's biblically based writings that actually transformed much of Western Europe and then later the Americas with a biblical understanding of marriage and family, which lasted over 400 years until the sexual revolution, as we call it, in the 1960s. Yes, some are called to a life of celibacy, but God's normal plan was for human beings to marry. It was ordained before the fall of man, before sin entered. sex was part of the material world that God declared to be good. And God made only one woman for man, and the two of them, the Bible says, become one flesh. So this led what Luther, as he exposited the Bible, New Testament scriptures, the monasteries emptied out. And this was really the basic theological factor that caused the Protestant nations to develop economically faster than the Catholic countries, and to build egalitarian democracies where there was social equality. The family then motivated parents to plan, to earn money, to sacrifice for their children, for their family, to save and to invest for the future generations, and indeed for the future of civilization itself. Women were empowered because the biblical standard required husbands to remain faithful, committed, and loving to the same woman as until death do us part. So it gave women the security for their dignity and their rights. So a brief recap, we can look at the situation today, but I'm going to hand back to Roger at this point. Over to you, Roger.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart, for a brief whiz through 2,000 years of history in 10 minutes. That's brilliant. Yeah, so I'm Roger Allen. Those of you who are new to this would be the enabler of Together for Bristol. And so that's our aims to see the whole Christian community help bring transformation to the whole of life across the Bristol region. So we connect across churches and prayer networks and across 8 spheres of life. And one of those spheres is the family sphere, which is called Love Family. And so it's great to have the co-facilitator of Love Family and the founder of National Parenting Initiative, Jane Alt, with us today. And after Stuart and I have shared a bit, we'll interview Jane and then have a bit of discussion like we normally do at the end as well. So I think just to explain briefly, what I tend to do is a little bit of biblical perspectives on family, build on what Stuart's said. And then I quite often then earth it really in Bristol and in the sphere and what's going on in the sphere. So we'll do that today and next session as well. And as you know, one of the quotes that I enjoy is from John Stott, from that book Issues Facing Christians Today, where he sort of talks about a biblical worldview of creation. So the good, starting with love. The fall or the evil or the mess that we see the world is in, and then redemption, the new, sort of putting it right, and then finally new creation, the perfect, as he calls it, sort of eternal, which really only happens when Jesus comes back to a renewed earth. And he says that biblical worldview gives a framework in to fit everything, a way of integrating our understanding, the possibility of thinking straight, even about the most complex issues or topics. So in talking about family today, I just say that personally, I'm passionate about the family, be part of the family sphere with Jane, Love Family, been married for 30 years this summer. We've got 2 children, both young adults in their 20s now, a young man and a young woman. And so just as Stuart has done a quick overall history, in a couple of bits that I share today, I'll talk a little bit of sort of creation fall, and then I'll stop. And then when I come back later, I'll talk a little bit more about redemption when looking at family, sort of a biblical, a Christian framework for family. And obviously, pretty simple. It's not going into great depth, but just looking at a few key highlights for me. So creation, it talks, doesn't it, in Genesis 1 of God creating mankind in his own image. He created them male and female, and in the end he said that it is very good. They are very good. I think when it comes to valuing women, when it comes to issues around how we regard things like sex, I think it's important to know that it was very good originally. And he says that it's not good for man to be alone, and that woman is a suitable helper for man and vice versa. Also says that they knew each other, they had intimate love relationship, They knew each other sexually, and originally that was very good. And so in the Old Testament, in places like Song of Songs, you've got this sort of celebration of sexuality, you know, the lover, the beloved, words such as beautiful and pleasing. And Stuart quoted Matthew in the New Testament saying that in the beginning, God created male and female, and the two became one. And what God joined together, do not let man separate. And so sex within marriage is God's invention, and it's very good. It's for pleasure as well as for reproduction. I could personally recommend an excellent book, which is called Sacred Sex by Tim Allen Gardner, that looks into that. And yet, from a biblical perspective, there's also then the issue around the fall. If God is a God of love, he cannot force mankind to love God back, otherwise it wouldn't be love. And he cannot force people to love each other and to live in God's ways of love and righteousness. And so mankind can choose not to live God's ways. And there are big consequences, therefore, for marriage, for family, for society, as Stuart has painted for us already. It's called the fall of mankind. And the Bible's very real and honest about the mess of family life that we see all around us in society as a result of not living God's ways. A few examples of the consequences of that from the biblical sort of perspective talks of, you know, how it shouldn't be, of man ruling over women, talks about pain in childbirth, Genesis 3. And this is not how God created it to be originally. Talks about sort of idolatry of worshipping created things, Romans 1, verse 25. So things like lust and perversions regarding women as sex objects, that, you know, that's all creeping in with the fall. So even King Solomon, you know, with his 700 wives and his 300 concubines, it says he turned away from God to other gods, such as Molech, with those child sacrifices in the high places. And that led to sexual and spiritual unfaithfulness and adultery. And there were consequences even for Solomon, with his kingdom being taken away from him. And in the Old Testament, just touch on a few proverbs where it says plenty about the women folly and a quarrelsome or ill-tempered wife. So this is all part of the fall, how it shouldn't be. It also talks of foolish sons, males, who bring their fathers grief and ruin, especially through sexual immorality and involvement with adulteresses. It's very clear and very honest and open about the mess. And in Proverbs, again, it says adultery leads to death, utter ruin, and shame, as well, and as seen even in the life of King David and Bathsheba, where he committed adultery with Bathsheba, and eventually baby died. In 2 Samuel, there's consequences. So the Bible, as I say, is very real about sexual immorality and lust and orgies and their bad consequences for families and society. And Stuart has painted that picture in, you know, about showing itself in the reality of history. And he's given examples of that. Luke, for example, says it's better for a person to have a millstone round their neck and be thrown into the sea than to cause a child to sin. And 2 Timothy is very clear that in these last days, people will be disobedient to their parents. They'll worm their ways into the homes of weak-willed women. So it's describing a collapse of sexual morality and family, such as we see in society around us today. So I'm finishing in just a moment, but I just want to add a couple of little comments to what Stuart was saying about the sort of the Middle Ages view of sex, and how that touches in with our earlier sessions that we've had. And so I think a lot of that thinking of a bad view of sex crept in through people like Augustine, living sort of in around 400 AD. And he, of course, as we've said in previous sessions, was very much influenced by the ancient Greek worldview and thinking of Plato, particular, and later sort of Aristotle, but Plato at that time, and Neoplatonism, where the idea came in that matter is corrupt, whereas what we've said is that biblically, God says it is very good. Creation is very good. But from that ancient Greek worldview came this idea that it's corrupt. So Augustine, if you've read his Confessions, you'll know that he was promiscuous as a young man before becoming a Christian. And that also sort of tainted his view of sex as being corrupt and bad. He became a Manichaeism. And sort of the ideal from that Plato thinking was sort of to escape from the pollution of matter. And therefore the idea of sort of, Stuart's touched on it, but of celibacy, of becoming a monk, of monasticism in the Middle Ages as somehow being superior, that crept in through that sort of thinking, or Catholic priests even today being celibate. And so again, that is yet another example of that sort of 2,000-year-old virus or pandemic that we've talked about before, of that sacred secular divide. And we see that even, in every aspect of life. And here it is showing itself in family life, view of marriage, view of sex. Whereas, as Stuart says, under Luther, there was a restoration of a sort of good view of sex and of marriage, of sex within marriage, a part of God's good creation. And I'll come back to that a bit more when I talk about redemption, and we explore that after Stuart's said a few more words now, and then back to me, and then over to Jane.
Yeah, it's very true, Roger, what you're highlighting in terms of the Bible being a very open and transparent book. I mean, you touched on just a few examples, but really from the beginning in Genesis right the way through the remainder of the Old Testament, there is story after story of, including well-known Bible characters that God used powerfully in many cases, but there were many instances of the family life being a bit of a disaster, with rape and theft and lying and murder and adultery and polygamy being one example, because what we consider now as being a New Testament, well, a biblical basis of marriage between a man and a woman is very much a New Testament concept. As we look through the Old Testament, we don't see that in reality, and it comes about in the New Testament from the teachings of the Apostle Paul onwards, the last couple of thousand years, as we covered earlier. But from the 1960s onwards, we've seen progressively, as the decades have passed, an erosion of the biblical norms and the virtues that were in Western society and have been exported to many parts of the world, where marriage is accepted in many cultures as being in line with the kind of biblical pattern, but now is being rejected increasingly by society at large. One of the assertions for rejecting monogamy is that men by nature are polygamous. Therefore, monogamy is unnatural. But the point to note there, I think, is that all morality is designed to bring our present fallen sinful nature under the moral law. Just like wearing clothes can be considered unnatural, but it's a necessity because of what happened at the fall that Roger spoke about in Genesis, that changed everything. And so we still need that level of morality at this point. History teaches that by defining marriage as monogamy and making extramarital sex immoral, the biblical tradition laid down through the law of Moses, but actually starting to be outworked only in the New Testament, does lay down a wonderful foundation for stable families, for strong women, children, the economy and society. And that's what made America particularly strong, because of the empowerment it gave to women, more so even than in Europe, where we look at other cultures worldwide where women are still very much disempowered through their worldviews that are in those cultures. And keeping vows made before God and community, those of us who got married, obviously it was in front of witnesses, causes those people to learn to keep his and her word in other situations. So when this becomes a strong cultural value, then trust becomes the foundation for social life. And again, this foundation stone is being shaken by proponents who would put forward easy divorce. And we're seeing, even in more recent years, divorce being made easier for people in our nation. The family is to reflect God's image. Every man and woman bears God's image. Genesis 1, 26, 27. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. Again, this has implications in terms of redefinitions of marriage. Can it be something different to just one man and one woman? And we've seen again in the UK some years ago, and in many other Western nations, the definition of marriage has been changed, has been altered away from a biblical one. And I would argue that actually mankind does not really have a right to redefine marriage, because marriage, as with the family, are divine institutions that God has ordained. And so it's not for us to mess with those definitions and to change them. The Christian idea of marriage, though, doesn't work unless a husband and wife recognize their need for a savior, recognize their fallenness, their humanness, and can find grace and forgiveness. And when non-Christian marriages survive, that's a wonderful thing. And they do. And sometimes Christian marriages don't survive. But marriage really does need God's grace and forgiveness to be expressed by both parties, and to reflect our relationship with God and how he extends grace and compassion to us. So just to conclude, because the church, and we've talked about this before, is failing in its task to disciple the nation, when it does so, the nation starts discipling the church. The spirit of this postmodern age is now permeating the church. We're getting church leaders and bishops and others who are agreeing to marriage outside the biblical norm and agreeing to things which go against Scripture. So the family is certainly under attack today. Marriage is certainly under attack today. What response should the church have to this attack? And how can families be empowered today? That's what these podcasts are about, empowering people in the different spheres. And as we consider the sphere of family, that's the big question. How can families be empowered today? Back to you, Roger.
Thanks, Stuart. That's cool. I'm sure there'll be a bit of discussion around those thoughts later. So again, I'll talk a lot more shortly with a shorter contribution now than before. But just carrying on, I was saying from that biblical framework around family, I talked about creation and fall. And now we'll just have a quick look at redemption. Again, just a few brief verses, not anything comprehensive. But putting things right in the whole area of marriage and family life. Of course, right at the beginning, as we said, in creation, God was talking of one man and one woman at the start of the Old Testament, Genesis 1 and 2, before the fall. I guess it was really only after the fall, the whole thing of polygamy and the mess came into society. But often you talk about redemption as sort of creation regained. Although I think it's more than just that. And so there are, wonderful stories throughout the Old Testament of God giving a helper suitable for a man, a woman suitable for a man, and providing a wife for people like Isaac, being provided, miraculously through through faith, finding Rebecca, the right person, and Jacob through Rachel, finding Rachel. And there's a very sort of noble and high calling through the Old Testament about women. So I think of Proverbs in a few places where it talks about the wife of noble character. It says is a husband's crown. Wonderful portrayal in Proverbs 31:10-20 of a wife of noble character doing manifold tasks in quite a liberated way, really, including economic and so on. And so it's interesting in coming to the New Testament where you're talking of husband and wife relationships. So, for example, in Ephesians 5, verse 21-33, it's interesting, even in the NIV, that the heading about submission they put a heading in on verse 22 and leave out verse 21, which is talking about, verse 21 talks about submitting to each other. The male translators discuss, then put in a heading that says, submitting to women or whatever. And it then goes on to say about wife submitting to her husband. So there could be a bias even in where that heading, which isn't there obviously in the original translation, is put in. So wife submitting to her husband, whereas the previous verse talks about submitting to each other. And then of course it talks about husbands loving wife as Jesus loves the church. So, I mean, Jesus died for the church. Jesus came with a servant heart and action towards the church. He didn't rule over it like lording it over tyrannically. And so there's a whole, opposite view of how marriage should be discussed in the New Testament there. It talks also, of course, of children obeying, Colossians 3, verse 18. And the Christians, as Stuart was saying, being sexually pure, not lust, not debauchery, but self-controlled, in place like 1 Peter 4. So, as I say, not adultery. And yet, even there, Jesus and the woman caught in adultery, Jesus didn't stone that woman, didn't condemn, said, anyone who doesn't have sin, throw the first stone. And yet, at the same time, at the end, told the woman to sin no more. So he wasn't condoning, he's saying do not commit adultery, but he still loved the person. And that's in John 8. So marriage is honoured by all and needs to be kept pure. Hebrews 13. These are sort of the foundations that Stuart's talking about as the foundations of marriage and then of a healthy society, discipling nations. So church leaders are called, ideally, they need to be a husband and one wife, and they need to manage their own family well. Children need to obey with proper respect. The woman, the wife, is also worthy of respect. Children are not wild and disobedient, and there needs to be hospitality. Those are the sort of benchmarks, if you like, for Christian marriage. We'll talk more about sort of parenting and so on next session, but just quickly moving on, I wouldn't mind just screen sharing here briefly, if I can. Not getting there. I'll leave it. It's not doing it. So it's just talking, we're coming on to Jane in just a minute or two now, talking about the family sphere. It's nice in what I bring. I like to sort of earth it into our experience in Bristol. And, great to have the theory and the history. But how is that sort of being expressed in one place, imperfectly, in one place at this time? And so it's interesting with the family sphere. It's called, as I say, Love Family. Jane is the co-facilitator. A couple of brief things about it as I introduce Jane. It says that, we're a group of Christians from different churches and organizations, meet together a couple of times a month to pray. And there's lots of action going on to help bring the transformation of family life in the Bristol region. And we link to various organizations. And we'll talk about that next session in a lot more detail about the family sphere. But the vision for that family sphere talks about believing in strong marriages and families as being key to a healthy society. That we know this can be a real struggle, and that we long to see couples and parents in the Bristol region have easy access to help and support in their relationships. And so, Jane, brilliant to have you with us, and thanks for joining. Jane, as I say, founder of the National Parenting Initiative, NPI, also the co-facilitator of the Family Sphere, Love Family. And within the family sphere, there are sort of two legs, if you like. One is an emphasis on relationships and couples, and the other is around parents and parenting. And Jane, I know your particular passion with all of this, within all of this, is probably around parenting. And so just sort of three little elements, really, as we just discuss it a bit now. But I'd be really interested to know, in brief, your sort of story. You know, how was it that you became passionate about parenting? Because I mean, you're a barrister as well, aren't you, by career?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I was a barrister for 25 years, and the last 9 or 10 of those years was actually here in Bristol. But actually, I did cease being a barrister back at the end of 1994. So I have now been a barrister for longer than I was.
Yes.
Those last years, because that was covering the time when I had our 2 sons who were born in the 80s, I then went to part-time and therefore just concentrated on one area of law that happened to be family.
Okay.
So I professionally was dealing with family.
Yeah.
I became a Christian when I was 32. I've been a barrister for 10 years. And I think for me, the twin passions of my Christian life have been prayer and evangelism. I was involved with Prison Christian Fellowship. I was involved with co-leading the prayer group to Wandsworth Prison when we were in London. And yeah, it's just so interesting because I was actually Alpha Advisor, well, Alpha Administrator of our church in Bath, and then Alpha Advisor for Bath and North East Somerset. And then when we moved back to London for about 3 or 4 years, I actually became Alpha Advisor for the Southwest because Charles was still working in Bristol doing a reverse commute. And so Holy Trinity Brompton, which is the church I became a Christian at, is renowned for never letting you go. So I said to them, listen, I cannot be Alpha Advisor for Bath and North East Somerset when we no longer live in Bath. No, they said, but you could do the Southwest because your husband's from the Southwest. I said, all right, okay. So I was going in to the offices in Cromwell Road, and I happened to be working on the same floor as the person who, for the first 9 months of the National Parenting Initiative, was sort of was doing the operations of it.
Yeah.
And so that was very interesting listening what was going on. So then went in, because I actually didn't found it. It was started by large churches, leaders from the large churches like Hillsong and Jesus House and etc. And also the parenting providers. Like then things have moved on, but then it was Catholic Family Caring Trust, New Wine, and Nikki and Scylla Lee's parenting children, parenting teenagers.
Yes.
And so then when it was a question of sort of moving on and things were being changed in the Alpha setup, I was asked whether I would take on being coordinator of the MPI. And interestingly, when I thought about it, I thought, yeah, I'd like to do that, because actually I saw parenting and the sort of thing of really serving people in the area of parenting as soft evangelism.
Yeah.
It's actually really going to where the itch is, where people need. And it's a really good way of Christians to form relationships with non-Christians, and then, you know, to really pray them into the kingdom. So that was where I was coming from. And interestingly, as I took on this role, the Lord reminded me of the scripture that was very much around when we were meeting to pray for our children. We used to meet every week to pray for the school that the children were at, and all of that right through their growing up. And it was the Malachi 4:6. See, I will send you the prophet Elijah before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, or else I will come and strike the land with the curse. Fascinating, within the context of the day of the Lord.
Yeah.
Then you go to Luke 1:17, when the angel is speaking to Zechariah and talking about the baby that his wife's going to bear. And that says that he, John the Baptist, will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of the fathers to their children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. Again, in the context of preparation for Jesus' return. And what both you and Stuart have been talking about with the breakdown of family life in our nation, it makes one think, oh my word, you know, we are coming into that era. And because I was asked to take on the National Parenting Initiative, the bit, or as the Americans would say, the piece that one brings is within the area of parenting. And we actually have at the National Parenting Initiative the strapline, which is join us in transforming family life across the nation.
Yeah.
And I have increasingly been convinced that the only people who can be involved with the transformation of family life are Christians, because Christ in us, the hope of glory, because it's only God who transforms.
Okay. So Jane, just interested there, because Stuart has a couple of times talked about, you know, helping us empower people to bring transformation.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, I mean, please carry on what you're saying, but I'm particularly interested in what you're saying about sort of, you know, how does the NPI help, if you like, empower parents?
That's exactly what our mission is.
Yeah.
And our mission is to reach the churches.
Yeah.
Because it's the churches that have community with the families around them. But we Brits are pretty reluctant to start telling people how to bring up their children. I always remember a lovely friend of mine who said, I have learned never to criticize the children of anybody else's family, because the moment I do, one of mine, and she did have 6, one of mine will do something so horrendous that I will just be left with egg on my face. Very natural approach. But what I've noted with great interest is that God has been bubbling up some really good parenting programs, really good parenting support.
Yes.
So what we're trying to do, because we as a charity do not produce any parenting courses ourselves, we purely signpost to the charities and ministries that are producing. Kids Matter, an excellent program that your wife has trained as a facilitator, hasn't she? That is particularly directed at the vulnerable parents from deprived areas, particularly in the areas of poverty. Another one that has come over actually from the States, called Circle of Security, that is absolutely founded and based in the whole things of attachment and security and bonding. It's just so interesting what God is doing. I keep coming across stuff and people don't know. Now, this what fits in with me. I'm a natural networker. I mean, when I was first converted, a guy who became the Archbishop of Uganda, a lovely man called Henry Rombi, who I met when he used to come down to London. He was doing a postgraduate in Nottingham. He very sweetly wrote me a letter to encourage me. I'd only been a Christian a few months. And he wrote me a letter to encourage me, to tell me that I was a Barnabas, and suggesting I went to look that up in the Bible. And then, of course, saw Barnabas, son of encouragement. So that's the networking, encouraging is very much part of who I am.
Yes.
And it's getting, I mean, what is so interesting, it doesn't matter if you're a church leader or a government leader or what have you. One thing we seem to have lost in our society is the vital importance of the family unit, that the family unit is the building block of society.
Yeah.
And
so with NPI, Jane, is that sort of pointing any parents to courses that are being put on by churches in the locality? And there's a variety of courses. I mean, what are one or two other courses?
It's actually the other way around.
Okay, yeah.
It's equipping the churches with what is available.
Brilliant.
Whether they, I mean, there's a friend of mine that runs something called a company called Growbrain, and that hasn't been developed yet, but I can see there that individual church members could do the course that she does, and the fantastic, so interesting, on the brain of the way the baby's brain is developed in the first couple of years. Now, if church members could do that course and really get good at being able to pass it on, fantastic for the mother and toddlers groups.
Yeah.
And churches, there are 27,000 churches in our nation that run toddler groups. I should say parent and toddler groups,
Yes.
being politically correct.
Yes.
So it's that. And of course, since lockdown, there's very few face-to-face stuff happening. So we've gone online, which means that our website is transformed, and we've got blogs, and we've got all sorts of stuff to encourage and what have you. And we've gone onto all the social media platforms. We're doing Instagram, we're doing Twitter, and we've also launched a YouTube channel. And there we've done a couple of things. Funnily enough, the second series is called Empowering Parents.
Okay, brilliant.
That actually can be looked at by individual parents.
Yes.
Our first series was Families, a Toolkit for Church Leaders. So that was absolutely focused at church leaders to tell them what's out there.
Yeah.
Because church leaders are busy. They've got masses of stuff to apply their minds to. Why should they know the stuff that happens in the family sphere?
And so on the website would be you're pointing towards quite a few courses that you would know are probably the best courses from the Christian community that are out there around parenting. I don't know if there are just one or two final of those courses you want to touch on, or is that enough for now? It'd be good to open up for discussion in our last 15 minutes in a moment. But is there a final word for now, Jane, or is that enough for now?
One of the things since lockdown we've been able to open up to is actually a charity called Fegans. Now, James Fegan was a contemporary of George Muller, so their charities are the same age. And Fegans, they do holistic supporting of family life with counselling of the children and parental support of the parents. And that's been very interesting because, of course, they can actually do pediatric counselling from year 7 up online. They are no longer constrained to geography because they are actually based in Kent and Tunbridge Wells, Sussex. So it's really trying to keep abreast of all the things that are developing. And I am encouraged because I can see, oh my goodness me, Lord, that's absolutely fascinating. I found something the other day that's actually something for schools, but the culture of the heart. And I thought, that's very like Imagine, something else that I know in other parts of the country. So you're sort of finding all different parts of the country and telling people about them. It's cross-fertilization because British people like a choice. They do not like to be told what they should do. But if you can go along and say, look at all of this, take your choice, whatever suits you and your people and your area the best, take it.
Yeah, brilliant. Jane, thanks so much. And, for our last 15 minutes now, as ever, just opening it up to a bit of discussion. And Paul, it's so great to have you with us again. It may be that you've got some comments to make on what's been said. Obviously, if you haven't, that's no problem, but you're so welcome just to chip in as ever with a thought or two. So any comments back of things that you think you want to reinforce or otherwise that you're sort of wanting to question and wonder why things were said?
Well, just quickly, what Jane was saying about parenting courses being a good way of reaching people in the local community, I very much endorse that. My own church in Guildford adopted this strategy for a good many years, and the church ran a parenting course, standard secular one, and got lots of people coming along to it. Good, strong material in it. At the end of that, they said that you want to, we guess you want to pass good values onto your children. So you want to have a good, solid set of values to pass on to your children and understand what they are and why you believe them, don't you? So we've got, there's an optional next another few weeks that we can do of training about that if you're interested. And the group that had bonded well on the the original course generally wanted to stay together, and they were enjoying it, and this was a good move. So they wanted to. Most people would stay on for the second part, which was introducing Christian values and identifying why they mattered. Very much covering the sort of ground that you have been covering today. And then at the end of that, they'd be told that if you want to understand more about these values and where they come from, then we've got an alpha course starting.
Yes.
So if you'd like to continue, yes, you're very welcome to join us. They didn't spring them on. This was all carefully the groundwork laid, so it wasn't a last minute, but it was all carefully prepared. But so people moved from the parenting course to the values course to the alpha course, and a great many people came through into the church as a result of that absolutely sort of sensible, carefully constructed, attractive, effective strategy. And I really do not understand why more churches do not follow through with this sort of this approach. It was pragmatic, it worked for people, and at every stage you were working with what people were looking for and wanting.
It's interesting how values are a great bridge there, Paul, aren't they?
Absolutely, yes. Yes, people, and it is something that people, when they become parents, they often start thinking about this sort of thing for the first time. You don't think about your own values when you're just living, but if you've got a responsibility to bring up your children and to instill good values in them, well, hey, that's a bit worrying if you don't really know what your own values are or what they're based upon.
It's really, really helpful, Paul. Can I just come back to you for a moment and just wonder, out of everything that's been said today, is there anything else that you'd like to raise, particularly including, stuff that you may not particularly agree with necessarily?
Yeah. Well, I think that there was quite a bit that I would want to question and examine, but A, this isn't my session, and B, there really isn't time. No. Just one quick point. I recognise the mistakes that the Catholic Church made in priestly celibacy and so on, which wasn't the original position for priests in the Catholic Church, but it evolved over time. But this was described as being contrary to God's plan that we should all marry, whereas in the New Testament, St. Paul has several passages where he makes it quite clear that within the early church, actually singleness and lifetime celibacy actually, in Paul's perspective, is the superior position. It seems to me that while I'm absolutely not endorsing the Catholic Church's way they implemented it, it seems to me that they were definitely trying to be faithful to a biblical truth and a biblical perspective.
Very good point. Very good point. And Paul, is that all you want to say for now? Is there a final thing?
Yes, I think that's all I can helpfully contribute. Okay.
Any comment back, Stuart? Any thoughts back on that? And Jane, in a moment, perhaps, if you want.
Yeah, just Paul's comment. Yeah, I did try and highlight that celibacy is an option for some people. They may choose that, or we can look at. I can think of a famous Christian in the public arena who chose to remain celibacy to pursue his career, and he's had huge influence in the arts and entertainment world as a result. So yeah, certainly it's not a kind of a lesser calling. So I think, yeah, the New Testament certainly gives room for celibacy and singleness alongside marriage. I'd be interested to hear from Jane, either now or maybe next session, in a little more detail, whether in all your wonderful efforts in the family sphere in Bristol and surrounding regions, wherever your influence goes, whether you've encountered any kind of underlying objections to some of these courses and programs, given the conflicts that we're experiencing in terms of the biblical view of marriage and family, which has been very much under attack.
Just to say, you know, we've sort of 4 or 5 minutes left today. You know, I really respect the way Paul's saying, you know, you can't just touch on these bigger issues in a short time. Paul, you know, if you're available in a couple of weeks' time, you know, there could be scope to knock some of those issues around then as well. So just being respectful to everyone, that there's sort of 3 or 4 minutes left. I don't know if you just want to touch on that as a taster for what we could discuss in more detail with our second. So we're sort of doing 2 sessions per sphere, as Stuart said at the start.
There's something very interesting that I'd love to bring in, but after Paul.
Go for it.
Okay. You know what's happened recently about that new website that somebody called Sarah has founded, called Everyone's Invited. And that is revealing a lot of child-on-child sexual abuse happening in the schools.
Yeah.
And there have been about 11,500 testimonies of things happening. And we may now be in a position as Christians and as churches to really be able to feed in. If you don't teach values, if you don't teach that sexual intercourse is a real gift for monogamous marriage, it is not a leisure activity. If you don't teach these things, then you are going to have happening what is happening in our schools. And I think a lot of right-thinking people, whether they're believers or not, are actually getting very worried. And Robert Halfon, the chairman of the Commons Education Committee, has reportedly said, we need to ask deeper questions about why some boys have attitudes that mean they don't treat female students with dignity and respect. Well, we have got the answers to this. And what I want to do is to encourage Christians to be brave and to be bold, to be gracious and come in, you know, not being aggressive, but just really pointing to the things that have always enabled, as Stuart was saying earlier, have enabled a society to flourish. And pointing out, I was in my teens, late teens, early teens in the 60s. I was 64, I left school age 17. So I was around when that all started, the sexual liberation all started. And I don't think anybody then had any idea of what it was going to lead to. But and we have got to start speaking into this, but we want to do it in a way that isn't critical, but is saying this is the best. And this is why we say it's the best. So the best gift parents can give their child is to be married to each other and is to have a good, strong relationship with each other.
Yeah, great.
So you can move on from parenting courses into a marriage course or relationships, like my co-facilitator and her husband and another couple run the Relationships Academy here, and which just started here in
Brilliant, Jane.
That's what I would like to say.
That's so cool, and that sort of would lead us on to the next session, where we probably talk more widely about the love family sphere, which isn't just parenting, but as Jane's saying, is around relationships. Paul, I don't know, again, totally up to you, but I don't know, you're right, and we're really thankful, you know, really respect your way of not wanting to sort of hijack what's being said in a sense today. But, you know, in the last minute or so, for next time, do you feel that there are 1 or 2 issues that particularly would be good, not just to leave there with what has been said today, but actually perhaps could helpfully be discussed a little bit more?
Well, I think there's two aspects I would want to raise as being important subjects that need to be addressed. I mean, there's the position and role of single people in the church. I hear a lot of talk about the importance of families and family life, and families being the core of society and so on. And I talk to a lot of single people, and they feel totally marginalised by the churches. They feel that they don't belong, they don't have any value, they don't have any role. So not disagreeing with the importance of marriage within society, but a one-sided message can be quite harmful sometimes. And the other thing is that I think something needs to be said actively about homosexuality and the related issues. And just saying it's not God's plan and it's dreadful isn't a message.
No.
It's not enough. You can't win hearts and minds by just with that message. So more needs to be said and communicated, and so I think singleness and homosexuality are both vital topics that we need to address and talk about in a godly, loving way. Yeah,
brilliant. And Paul, thanks so much. And as you say, it's maybe something we can touch on next time. I don't know how you feel around those things, Stuart, but I don't need to say anything now particularly. I don't know if you just want to conclude things for us in a minute or whatever.
Well, thanks, Paul, for sharing those. We'll see if we can pick up on those next time in some way. And Jane, it would be good maybe to connect and discuss further any other thoughts and areas that you may have to contribute that could be touched on again in a bit more detail for next time. Some of these issues Paul's mentioned too. There will be others that you've just responded briefly about, which we could give a bit more time to. So yeah, let's communicate some more in the next couple of weeks before the next session.
Brilliant. And thanks so much, everybody. I mean, next time I'll finish off a bit more on the sort of biblical redemption aspects, but also, as I say, we'll touch more widely about the love family, the family sphere, and aspects of that we haven't touched on today. So Paul and Jane, thank you so much for joining us. Stuart, thanks so much for leading us as ever. And God bless you all, and look forward to a fortnight when we get back together again. So thank you all. God bless. Goodbye then.